Transformations, Women, Gender, and Psychology, 3rd edition by Mary Crawford. Chapter 7, Sex, Love, and Romance. Sex, love, and romance seem like natural evidence, instinctive, unlearned, and universal. For example, think about a kiss. Perfectly natural, right? In Western societies, kissing is seen as an instructive way to express love and increase arousal. Yet in many cultures, kissing is unknown. When people from these cultures hear about our kissing customs, they argue that these practices are dangerous and unhealthy, or just plain disgusting. When members of one African community first saw Europeans kissing, they laughed and said, "Look at them. They eat each other's saliva and dirt." Strange as it may seem, sex, like kissing, is not a natural act. In other words, sexuality is not something that can be understood in purely biological terms. Instead, it is a social construct. How is sexuality shaped by culture? Every culture throughout the world controls human sexuality. Because men have more social and political power, this control usually works to their benefits. For women, cultural construction of sexuality lead to an ongoing tension between pleasure and danger. What are sexual scripts? Each of us learns rules and norms around sexual behavior, the who, what, when, where, and why, of what we are allowed and not allowed to do sexually. These rules are guidelines, are terms sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are schemas for sexual concepts and events, used in guiding one's behavior and interpreting others' behavior. For example, when college students back in the 80s were asked to list what people would typically do on a first date, they agreed on things like go out, get to know each other by joking and talking, try to impress the date, kiss goodnight, and go home. On this script, when men asked for the date and initiated physical contact. In more recent studies, much of the old date script is gone, but it is still the guy who makes the first advance. Contemporary social scripts. Today's social scripts are much more varied than the dating scripts of the 80s. They include everything from Cinderella-like romances to hooking up and friends with benefits. Let's take a closer look. Romantic ideology, a core element of social scripts. Romantic ideology includes the belief that love is all you need. True love lasts forever. True lovers become one. Love is pure and good, and anything done in the name of love cannot be wrong. The ideology of love is positive, but it is something used to justify horrible acts such as stalking, sexual assaults, and even murder. In our society, the ideology of romantic love is everywhere. From earliest childhood, girls are encouraged to identify with heroines who are rescued by a handsome prince, who are awakened from the coma of virginity by the love of a good man, or whose transform an unpromising prospect into a good catch throughout their unselfish devotion. One pervasive source of romantic ideology is romance novels. A $1.8 billion industry each year and still growing. Each of their covers features a woman, almost always young, white, and beautiful, gazing rapturously up into the eyes of a tall, strong, and handsome man. Romance novels aimed specifically at adolescents are sold through school book clubs, gaining in popularity every year. Although most romance novels are published in the US, England, and Canada, their readership is global. No one would claim that these novels are great literatures. They follow a predictable script. Love overcomes all obstacles. The heroine attracts the hero without planning or plotting on her part. In fact, she often fights her attraction which she experiences as overwhelming both physical and emotionally. Her knees go weak, her head spins, her heart pounds, and her pulse quickens. The hero is often cold, insensitive, and rejecting, but by the end of the novel, the reader learns that his coldness has merely been a cover for his love. The heroine is swept away and finally gives in the power of love and desire. Why do so many women enjoy these fantasies? Although the hero is initially cold, patronizing, sometimes even brutal, he actually loves the heroine, and the power of her love transforms him into a sensitive and caring partner. In reading the romance, women may learn to interpret a male partner's insensitivity or controlling behavior as evidence that underneath the gruff exterior is a manly heart of gold. Not surprisingly, this is an appealing fantasy. It also may be a dangerous one. TV provides another major source of romantic scripts. According to a Harris poll, nearly half of U.S. teens say that it is their major source of information about love and romance. What lessons are they learning? A survey of 625 college students found that those who watched marriage reality TV had stronger beliefs in love at first sight and finding the perfect partner. Those who watched romantic comedy movies believe that love overcomes all obstacles, and those who preferred sitcoms had the least romantic beliefs at all. These results are correlational and cannot determine if the particular kind of media exposure caused the belief, but it is interesting that the belief corresponding to the media messages in marriage reality TV, people fall in love almost immediately in rom-coms. Love always finds a way, and in sitcoms there is often a more cynical view of relationships. There is another side to the sexual scripts in the media: gender inequality. In content analysis of the 25 primetime TV shows most watched by teens, the predominant script was of heterosexual male-dominant relationships that sustained gender inequalities. Males are portrayed as sexually active and aggressive, whereas females were portrayed as willingly objectifying themselves. In a study of reality TV dating shows, college students who were merely involved in watching such shows were more likely to think of relationships as adversely. Males and females are in the contents with different goals. They were more likely to believe that men are driven by sex, that appearance is very important in relationships, and that dating is a game. In summary, romantic ideology encompasses positive aspects of love, such as mutual devotion and intimacy, but also conveys more dubious or even harmful messages. A woman is nothing without a man, and men should be aggressive initiators of love and sex, whereas women should be coy, receptive gatekeepers. A man's controlling behavior is acceptable and even exciting if it is done in the name of love. A woman should objectify herself if that's what it takes to be loved. In contrast, taking care of yourself and your partner by practicing safe sex is rarely part of the script. And it almost goes without saying that all the scripts are heterosexual. Hookup scripts. Hooking up refers to sexual activity between two people who are not in a romantic relationship. When researchers asked college students to describe a typical hookup, the script including going to a party, friends were there, drinking alcohol, flirting, hanging out and talking, dancing, and sexual activity. However, the exact sexual activity in a hookup is ambiguous. It can range from hugging and kissing to oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse. When sociologist Danielle Courier interviewed college students about their hookup history, she found that 85% reported having hooked up at least once. At the same time, they struggled to define it, anything from kissing to having sex. It is difficult now to actually say what it is. It's in the eye of the beholder. Courier's interview suggests that the ambiguity of the term may be useful, as college men are under pressure to demonstrate their masculinity through sexual conquest, and college women want to avoid the label slut. By using the generic term hookup, neither men nor women have to say exactly what sexual activities they are doing. Other scripts for casual sex include friends with benefits, in which two people who are friends but not romantically involved sometimes have sex with each other. A fuck buddy is a person that an individual only has sex with, not a romantic partner or a friend. People can also have casual sex relationships through the booty call, a text or phone call request for a sexual meetup. In hookup scripts, sex is acceptable between partners who have no intention of engaging in a committed relationship or even contacting each other again. On the other hand, today's sexual scripts are more egalitarian than in past. They portray both women and men as interested in sexual pleasures and active in pursuing it. On the other hand, casual sex scripts treat sex as just a game. One group of researchers analyzed all the articles on how to have better sex from 70 issues of various widely read magazines for women and men. They found that most of the advice was about technique and variety. Advice that focused on good sex as part of a relationship was far down on the list. Men were depicted as wild, aggressive, and animalistic in their sexuality, whereas women were advised to be coy, indirect, and focused on men's pleasure. Sexual scripts differ across ethnic groups and cultures. Scripts about sex, love, and romance are influenced by race and class, as well as by gender. Table 7.1, based on national samples, shows some aspects of scripts that differ among ethnic groups in the U.S. In this table, you can see that the intersectionality of gender and ethnicity, along with religiosity, shapes a person's sexual script. Scripts about sex, love, and relationships are even more variable from one society to another. For example, people in the U.S. believe that love is necessary for marriage. But in most of the world, marriages are arranged by family members, not by the bride and groom. Romantic love may be viewed as irrelevant or even destructive. In a study of college students in 11 cultures, India, Pakistan, Thailand, Mexico, Brazil, Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Australia, England, and the U.S., participants were asked whether they would marry someone they were not in love with, if the person had all the other qualities they desired. In India and Pakistan, about half said yes. In Thailand, the Philippines, and Mexico, about 10 to 20% agreed. However, in other countries, including the U.S., only a tiny minority of people said they would marry without love. In a culture like ours, where romantic love is strongly endorsed, not being in a relationship can be pretty lonely. One study compared college students in the U.S. and Korea, a culture where romantic love is not as important as family obligations. The U.S. students felt lonelier than the Korean students when not in a relationship, and happier when they were in one. Apparently, U.S. culture amplified both the positive and negative feelings around romantic love. Cultural beliefs about sex and romance may affect more than feelings. They lead to ethnic group differences in sexual behavior. For example, compared with American college students, Chinese students started dating at a later age, date less often, and are less likely to have sex with their dates. A comparison of Asian and non-Asian students in a Canadian university showed that the Asian students were more conservative in their behaviors. For example, they were less likely to have had sexual intercourse or to masturbate, and they had fewer partners, if sexually active. The Western ideal of romantic love is spreading as the rest of the world adopts U.S. and European media. However, it gets interpreted in terms of local norms. In India, for example, dating is usually unacceptable. Women are expected to be virgins when they marry, and romantic love has little or nothing to do with choosing a life partner. Yet India may be the world's largest market of romance novels. A study of more than 100 young, single, middle-class Indian women suggested that reading romance novels is a form of cultural resistance. And then women explored alternative kinds of relationships with men. They admired the spunky, feminine, but strong heroines. And they gained information about sexuality. As one woman said, she had learned about the biology of sex at school. But it was from romance novels that she learned there is nothing wrong with sex. Indeed, that it is pleasurable. For better and for worse, romance novels, reality TV, and Hollywood movies are part of the globalization of Western culture. Adolescent sexuality. How does sexuality emerge in the teen years? With puberty comes a surge in sexual interest and behavior. During the last 50 years, there have been large changes in patterns of sexual activity in the teen years, both in the U.S. and around the world. More teens are having sexual intercourse outside of marriage. The increase has been greater for girls. First intercourse is occurring at an early age on average. In the 1940s, only about 33% of U.S. females and 7% of males had intercourse outside marriage by the age of 25. Sexual scripts of the time emphasized virginity before marriage for girls. For boys, not so much. In the most recent national study, 70% of females and 78% of males reported having intercourse prior to marriage. The gender gap in sexual experience has almost disappeared. However, boys still have first sex at an early age than girls, despite reaching puberty at a later age. Comparison of countries around the world show that the average age of first intercourse is similar, between 16 to 18 years in most countries. However, the percentage of unmarried women who have intercourse is lower in Latin American countries than in the U.S. or Africa, due to the influence of Catholicism. Increasingly, young people experience mass media that expands sexual norms so that intercourse outside of marriage is becoming more globally widespread. What factors influence the decision to have sex? The initiation of sexual behavior depends very much on social factors. For both boys and girls, one of the strongest predictors of sexual activity is the perceived level of sexual activity of their best friends. A meta-analysis of studies on teens' sexual decisions, including nearly 70,000 adolescents in 15 countries, found that belief about others' behaviors were more important than the actual sexual attitudes of peers or the direct pressure of peers. In other words, teens start having sex mostly because they think their friends are doing it. In the words of one teenage girl, I just felt like everyone else was doing it and they were all talking about it and I didn't have anything to talk about. So I was like, yeah, I might as well. This raises troubling questions of free choice. In a study of sexually active girls aged 14 to 19 in urban Australia, the girls participated in in-depth interviews about their first experience of intercourse. Some said that they had been ready for the event, comfortable with the timing, and with their partners. I waited with my boyfriend for ages, just until I felt ready, until I trusted him, and that took a long time. Others reported that their first intercourse had been unwanted. Often they had been intoxicated at the time. I was 15, I was stupid, young, I shouldn't have done it. It just sort of happened at a party. I was drunk, he was drunk, it was bad. Some said they had given into the pressure despite being unready. I just did it to keep him happy. In a major national study in the U.S., women of all racial and ethnic groups were significantly more likely than men to report that their first sex was unwanted. Parents have some influence of their teens' sexual behaviors. In a study of urban African American teen girls, delayed their first intercourse experience was related to the amount of time spent with their mother, and boys was related to the amount of time spent with their father. Both African American and white girls who feel close to their parents and talk to them about sex engage in less sexual behavior than girls who do not. These studies show that it is important for parents to express support, love, and care for their teens while allowing them growing independence. One recent study followed a large sample of teens longitudinally for a year. At the start of the year, none of the teens had yet been sexually active. The biggest factor in these teens' delayed sexual initiation over the study's time period was parental caring. Parental efforts to control their behaviors were less effective. Although adults are quick to attribute teens' behaviors to raging hormones, the relationship between hormones and sexual activity is complex. Hormonal levels have a strong effect on the levels of girls' sexual interest, but only weak effects on her sexual behaviors. An early age of menarche has been associated with earlier sexual activity among both black and white adolescents, probably due to both hormonal changes and social pressure. As discussed in Chapter 6, early puberty leads to early gender intensification, which has more consequences for girls. How early is too early for sex? Developmental psychologists agree that having sex before age 15 is harmful because teens at that age are not yet cognitively ready for safe and consensual sex. They tend to be impulsive and easily influenced by social pressure, increasing their risk for unprotected sex, sexually transmitted infections, and unintended pregnancies. Long-term studies show less positive outcomes for both boys and girls who have early sex. Teens and safe sex. We've noted that young people often base their sexual decision-making on what they think others are doing. This is true for risky behaviors as well as sexual initiation. A large-scale study of U.S. college students showed that students believed that their peers engaged in more risky behaviors than their peers actually reported, and they based their own risk-taking on the perception of what others were doing. This study and others like it suggest that one way to reduce risky sexual behavior is to provide young people with accurate information about norms for their peers group. However, peer group norms may be problematic. Romantic sexual scripts suggest that women would be swept away by love. Hookup scripts treat sex as just a game. Neither type of script allows much room for women to negotiate condom use and other responsible sexual practices with their partners. The consequence is an increased risk of unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. These include bacterial infections, viral infections, and HIV. All of these STIs are transmitted by genital, anal, or oral sexual contact, and all can have serious long-term health consequences. Although STIs are a risk for sexually active people in any age group, teens are particularly vulnerable because they tend to have more partners and because they are inconsistent in using protection. Half of the STI cases in the U.S. each year occur in young people aged 15 to 24, and 1 in 4 sexually active adolescent girls have an STI. The AIDS epidemic continues. Over 75 million people worldwide are infected, almost half of whom are women. In the U.S., women now account for 23% of AIDS cases. The great majority of U.S. women living with HIV and AIDS became infected through heterosexual contact. Injection drug use accounts for most other cases. HIV/AIDS is now the leading cause of death for African American women aged 25 to 34, and the fifth for all women in the same age group. Condoms are the most effective means of preventing STIs during heterosexual contact, but media depiction of sex and romance almost never include the use of condoms in sexual encounters. This may be one reason why many people do not use condoms consistently, even when they know about their effectiveness. In a study of female college students, those who read the most romance novels had the most negative attitudes and intentions about condom use. This study also showed that including safe sex scripts in romantic stories led to more positive attitudes towards condoms. Experiencing sexuality. First intercourse, less than bliss. Sociologists and psychologists have studied the factors that influence the decision to have sex for the first time. But what about the experience of first sex? There has been much less research. In our society, it's called losing your virginity, and the script is romantic. Here is one example taken from Harlequin romance novels. For a long, timeless moment, Rhodey gazed down at the sleeping figure, watching the soft play of moonlight on her features. Gently, he pulled back the blankets and lay down beside the motionless girl. She turned in her sleep, one hand flung out towards him. Tenderly, he stroked a dark strand of hairs from her face, then pulled her into his arms. Still half drugged from brandy and sleep, she found herself stroking his hair. Such a perfect dream, she murmured, her eyes already beginning to close again. No dream, my lady. And Rhodey's mouth found hers. Silencing her words, tenderly he slipped the ribbon straps of her nightdress over her shoulders, and her body arched up towards him as his fingers traced a burning path across her breasts. A groan vibrated deep in her throat as he threw her nightdress to the floor. Then his body was pressed along hers, and she gasped at the feeling of skin on naked skin. Driven now only by pure instinct, she moved against him, raining kiss down on his hair-roughened skin, tracing her fingers down the hard strength of his muscled chest. His breathing became ever more ragged, his hands slipping under her to pull her closer still, and she gave a tiny cry of surrender as he finally claimed her body, her fingers digging his shoulders as they moved together in frenzied rhythm. A vast well seemed to surge up within her, and the room explored into fragmented light. She heard a voice crying, "I love you." There may be a gap between the romantic ideal and reality. In a study of 1,600 American college students, women reported more guilt and less pleasure than men did when remembering their first sexual intercourse. When asked to rate the pleasure of their first intercourse on a scale of 1 to 7, the woman gave it an average score of 2.95. This account is from a sexual autobiography written by a college sophomore, reproduced here exactly as she wrote it. I don't think I will ever forget the night that I did lose my virginity. It was this past September, September 7th to be exact. My boyfriend and I had been going out for 6 months. I met him at a party late that night, but by the time I had gotten there, he was extremely drunk. We came back to my room because my roommate was not going to be there. Well, my boyfriend was very drunk and very amorous, to say the least. Once we got into bed, I knew exactly what he had in mind. He was all hands and lips. I figured that we might as well have sex. So I made the decision to let him do whatever he wanted. For the actual act of sex itself, I hated it the first time. Not only was it painful, but it made a mess on my comforter. I hated my boyfriend at the time. I actually kicked him out of my room and sent him home. I was upset for a lot of reasons. My boyfriend was too drunk to remember the night, so I had made the wrong decision in letting him do whatever he wanted. There had been no feelings involved. I hadn't enjoyed it in the slightest. I had lost my virginity and betrayed my parents, and I was upset for just a couple of days. After the first night, the sex between my boyfriend and myself had been great. The experience of first intercourse tends to be difficult for young women and young men. In a sample of white African American, Asian American, and Latino college students who were asked to describe their first experience of sexual intercourse, the top descriptors were both positive, special and perfect and memorable, and negative. We didn't really know what we were doing. Not pleasant, didn't feel good. As in past research, men were more likely than women to describe first intercourse as generally positive and physically pleasurable, and women to describe it as painful and negative. However, women, more often than men, describe it as a positive emotional experience. Losing one's virginity has many meanings. Researcher Lauren Carpenter explored those meanings by interviewing a diverse sample of 61 young people: straight, gay, lesbians, a varying religious, socioeconomic backgrounds, and ethnicities. 3 ways of thinking about sexual initiation stood out in the interviews. The first, mentioned by about half the respondents, was that virginity is a gift given by one partner to the other. Not surprisingly, the gift metaphor, which may be influenced by abstinence-only sex ed programs in schools, was used more by heterosexual women. The second view, endorsed by more than 1/3 of respondents, was that virginity is a stigma to be gotten rid of. The stigma metaphor was used more by heterosexual men, but some women used it too. In rejecting traditional notions of femininity. The third view was that virginity's loss is a step in process. For heterosexuals, a process of becoming an adult. For LGBTs, a process of coming out. The qualitative research method used in this study does not permit us to make conclusions about the general population, but it does provide a rich picture of how people in the sample made meaning of their own experiences. It seems that virginity means different things to different people. Women's experience of orgasms. Women who have not had a lot of sexual experiences are sometimes unsure about whether they have had an orgasm because they do not know how it's supposed to feel. One way to get an idea of the subjective experience of orgasms is to ask women to describe their own behaviors and sensations. Sheer Height did just that in a survey of more than 3,000 women. Although her research methods were not very systematic, Height appealed woman to her prospective sample and used an open-ended question. Many of her respondents wrote lengthy, detailed answers. The Height report was a feminist sensation on its day because it described orgasms and other sexual experiences in women's own voices. Is the experience of orgasm different from women and men? Research suggests that the experiences are similar. In a study in which college students were asked to write descriptions of their orgasms, judges, psychologists, and physicians could not reliably distinguish women and men's descriptions. In a recent qualitative survey of British young adults, both men and women described orgasms as the main goal of sexual activity and the ultimate pleasure. Both men and women experienced better orgasms when they were comfortable with their partner and aware of each other's sexual preferences. Evils of masturbation or joy of self-pleasure. Stimulating one's own genitalia is very common sexual practice. Traditionally, this practice was given the clinical term masturbation, which made it seem like a disorder. Indeed, masturbation was thought to cause everything from dark circles under the eyes to insanity. However, the majority of people today believe that it is neither harmless nor wrong. More positive terms for masturbation include self-pleasuring and self-gratification. Women usually masturbate to stimulate the clitoris, either by hand or with a vibrator. Other methods include pressing the clitoral area against a pillow or using a steam of water while in the bath or shower. Most women who masturbate engage in sexual fantasies while doing so. Height survey respondents described both their techniques and their fantasies. there is a persistent gender difference in masturbation experience. Curiously, women do not report more negative attitudes towards masturbation than men do, but they are definitely less likely to say they do it. Only about 42% of women in a national study reported that they had ever masturbated, compared to virtually all the men. And African American and Asian American women have lower rates than white women. For young women in our society, developing a positive attitude about masturbation may take time, due to the cultural silence and shame around it. When college women were asked to write narratives about their feelings and experiences with masturbation, stories like these were common. When it comes to sexuality, my mom was open to discussing anything I had questions about. However, for some reason, I missed ever learning about masturbation or being in any discussion about masturbation. I grew up in a very Christian household, and I thought sex and sexual play was shameful before marriage. I thought all forms of sexual experience was dirty. Self-pleasure can be an important way for women to learn about her patterns of sexual arousal and satisfaction. Through practice, she can learn what fantasies are most arousing, what kinds and amounts of stimulation are most enjoyable, and what to expect from her body. For these reasons, sex therapists frequently use education in self-pleasuring for women who are unable to experience orgasms with a partner. Feminists writers have encouraged women to use self-gratification as a route to erotic skill and sexual independence. Lesbian and bisexual women. So far, the discussion in this chapter has been about heterosexuality because it is the dominant, socially approved form of sexual expression and the one that has clear, pervasive scripts. Let's turn now to other sexual identities and experiences, those of lesbians and bisexual women. Defining sexual orientation. A lesbian is a woman who is emotionally and sexually attracted to other women. A bisexual woman is capable of emotional and sexual attraction to both women and men. Although these definitions are straightforward, sexual orientation is a complex matter involving not just attraction, but also have intimacy, fantasies, behavior, and most important, the individual's subjective sense of sexual identity. Non-heteronormative identities are hard for the dominant cultures to assimilate. Individuals identifying as bi do not fit the gay-straight binary. Traditionally, some researchers and clinicians maintain that there is no such thing as a true bisexual, implying that they are just confused or indecisive and will eventually decide to be either gay or straight. Some bisexuals may have marginalized by both gay and straight cultures. They may be accused by the gay community of wanting to avoid the stigma of the homosexual label and of using cross-sex relationships to hide from their homosexuality. On the other hand, some feminists maintain that bisexuality is a revolutionary concept because it challenges the title box of sexual orientation and pushes society beyond dualistic thinking about sexuality. Indeed, some bi people say that their bisexual identities reflect their gender politics. They are attracted to people, not gender categories. As transgender identities are becoming more socially visible, so is the question of who counts as a woman. If a lesbian-identified woman transitions to a trans man, is she still part of the lesbian community? What about people who identify as gender queer, both male and female, or neither, but self-identify as a lesbian? Social psychologist Charlotte Chucky Tate has proposed new models of sexual orientation that define women as any female-identified person, even if the person was not labeled female at birth, thus including transgender and genderqueer self-identified lesbians in the category. Tate maintains that if we truly believe that gender is socially constructed, then female gender identity, the lived experience of being female and being a lesbian, are open not just to those who were assigned female at birth, but those who identify as females later in life. Even among cisgender women, those whose gender's identities match their birth sex. People do not always mean the same thing when they say, I am a lesbian. A pioneering study done in England by psychologist Celia Kitzinger compared the explanation of stories about the experience of lesbian identities of 41 self-identified cisgender lesbians ranging in ages of 17 to 58. 5 viewpoints emerged from a close comparison of the accounts. The first viewpoint was that the idea of lesbianism as a personal fulfillment, women who viewed themselves primarily in this way were sure of being lesbians, were unashamed of the orientation, and thought of themselves as happy, healthy individuals. I have never stopped feeling relief and happiness about discovering myself and, accepting myself and finding all these other women. It means that I'm happy almost every day of my life. I've never regretted being a lesbian. A second viewpoint defined sexual preference in terms of love. Being a lesbian was seen as a result of falling in love with a particular person who just happened to be a woman. Though defining themselves as lesbians, those women felt that they could or would have a sexual relationship if they fell in love with a man. A third viewpoint had to do with the feeling of being born that way, yet resisting sexual labeling. I am me. I'm a social worker. I'm a mother. I've been married. I like Tchaikovsky. I like Bach. I like Bach. I like Beethoven. I like ballet. I enjoy doing 1,001 things. And oh yes, in amongst all that, I happen to be a lesbian. I love a woman very deeply, but that's just a part of me. The fourth view included a woman who came to identify as lesbians through radical feminism. It was only through feminism, through learning about the oppression of women by men and the part that the enforcement of heterosexuality, the conditioning of girls into heterosexuality plays in that oppression. It was through that I decided that whatever happens, I will never go back to being fucked by men. That decision was made because I'm a feminist, not because I'm a lesbian. I like the label lesbian as part of the strategy of the feminist struggle. A final view identified a few women who saw their sexual orientation as a sin or weakness, a cross to bear. These women were sometimes ashamed of being lesbians, said they would not have chosen it and would be happier if they were heterosexual. This classic study explored the multiple meanings women give to their sexuality and its relationship to the rest of their lives. Each of the ways these women subjectively experienced their sexuality had both costs and benefits for their individual. The social meaning of sexual orientation has changed over time, and individuals' self-definition have likely changed with it. Definitions now have moved beyond the little boxes of gay or straight and are becoming more inclusive of transgender and genderqueer people. Stay tuned for further development. Developing a lesbian or bisexual identity. Coming out. Coming out is the process of acknowledging to oneself and then to other people that one is LGBT or genderqueer. Usually, LGBT people experiencing coming out as a series of milestones. Their first sexual attraction, first self-identification as LGBT, first LGBT sexual activity, and first disclosure to another person. In a randomized sample of over 1,200 LGBT adults ranging in ages from 18 to 84, most had self-identified at an early age. Women had their first sexual experience later than men, but disclosed earlier, possibly because being a lesbian is somewhat less stigmatized than being a gay man. Bisexual individuals had experienced the milestone about a year later than LG individuals on average. However, there is a lot of individual variability in the timing of these milestones. Gay, bisexual, and lesbian adolescents do not have an easy time. They are at higher risk for low self-esteem, emotional isolation, poor school performance, dropping out, and a variety of other problems. Being rejected by their families is strongly related to mental health problems in LGBT youth. In one study of white and Latina young people, those who reported higher levels of family rejection during adolescence were 8 times more likely to report having attempted suicide, 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, and 3 times more likely to use illegal drugs or engage in unprotected sexual intercourse compared with peers from families that did not reject them. Bisexual girls have particularly high rates of early sex, risky sex, depression, and drug use in high school. These studies show that it is important to provide for the psychosexual needs of LGBT teens and sexual counseling programs. Coming out as bisexual or lesbians can be hindered by stereotypes. In a qualitative study of bisexual identified college women, participants reported other stereotypes that a bisexual orientation is just a phase, or a display that women do for the enjoyment of heterosexual men, kissing girls when drunk or having threesomes. These stereotypes discredited the participants' identities by equating bisexuality with sexual promiscuity. Linda Garnetz, a lesbian feminist psychologist and professor of LGBT studies, described her own moment of truth. I remember the first time I met a lesbian couple. I was beginning to think that I might really be a lesbian, so I wanted to meet some other people who were gay. I knew very few gay people, and I had numerous fantasies about how they were going to look and act. I vividly remember standing by my front door waiting for them to arrive and having every possible stereotype about them. I thought they were going to ride up on motorcycles and have greasy hair and tattoos. I was shaking, but when I opened the front door, there stood 2 of the most ordinarily looking women. I thought they must be at the wrong apartment. Although coming out may be difficult, it has many benefits. In a national sample of more than 7,800 LGBT high school students, being out was related to higher self-esteem and lower depression. But being out isn't all positive. In the same study, it was also linked to verbal and physical harassment. For LGBT high school students, coming out is a form of resilience in the face of risk, one that promotes psychological well-being despite its hazard. Being out is related to greater social support, better relationships, and lower psychological distress for LB women of all ages. So far, I've been describing sexual identities as though it is fixed and unchangeable. Once a woman recognizes the essential truth that she is gay, straight, or bi, she's set for life. However, women's sexual identities seems to be potentially more changeable than that. Sexual fluidity refers to the change that occurs over time in one or more components of sexual orientation. This could include sexual attraction. A person can change from being attracted to men to being attracted to both women and men. Identity, a change from identifying as a lesbian to identifying as bisexual. Or behavior, having same-sex activity for the first time. Using interviews and survey methods, and following participants over time in longitudinal studies, psychologists have found that sexual orientation is not a done deal for everyone. Sexual fluidity is not at all uncommon, particularly in women. In a study of lesbian and bisexual women aged 14 to 21, self-identification had changed over time for many of the young women. More than half who identified as lesbians had identified as bisexual at some time in the past, and the majority had had sexual activity with both other women and with men. In a survey of 155 lesbian and gay young adults aged 18 to 26, the young women were significantly more likely than the young men to report sexual fluidity and attraction and identity. The women also were more likely to believe that sexuality is changeable and influenced by the environment. Recent studies also show considerable sexual fluidity in gender nonconforming, transgender, and polyamorous people. Polyamorous individuals are those who engage in more than one intimate relationship at a time. In the first longitudinal study of lesbian and bisexual women, participants were first interviewed when they were 16 to 23 and followed up 2 years later. Half had changed their sexual orientation more than once, and one-third had changed between the two interviews. Psychologist Lisa Diamond, after tracking the sexual orientation and behavior of her sample over a 10-year period, concluded that sexual fluidity is characteristic of female sexuality.